They were already digging the grave. Not as a warning. Not as a threat. As a plan. 3 men in the dark, moving quietly behind the eastern tree line of a plantation that sat at the edge of a county nobody in power paid much attention to, and that was precisely why they had chosen this county, this tree line, this hour. Because inattention was a form of permission. Because the dark absorbed things. Because a man could disappear in a place like this and the disappearance would be filed, if it was filed at all, under the category of things that happened and were not examined. The shovels made a sound. Not the sharp crack of metal meeting hard earth. The ground had rained 2 days before, and what the shovels made was something wetter, something that yielded, a soft, displaced sound like something giving way. Like something agreeing to receive what was being prepared for it. The man doing the most work was named Corwin. He was 44 years old. He had done this before. That fact, that he had done this before, that this was not new territory for his hands or his conscience, sat somewhere between explanation and indictment, and if you had asked him which one he would have looked at you the way a man looks at a question he has decided not to understand. He did not speak while he worked. The second man, Whitmore, 41, a laborer from the neighboring property, worked at Corwin's pace, matching it the way a man matches the pace of someone who seems to know where they are going. He had been told this was necessary. He had been told there was a problem. He had been given a shovel and a location and a time, and he had come because men like Whitmore come when men like Corwin ask them to, because the social architecture of that world ran on exactly that kind of quiet compliance. The third man was named Els. He was 26. He was breathing too fast. He had not done this before, and his body knew it even if his mind was trying to keep up with the logic that had been given to him, the logic that said this was necessary, that said the man they were preparing this for was a danger, that said this was the kind of problem that required this kind of solution. His mind was working with the logic. His body was not convinced. His shovel went in. Came out. Went in. Came out. He focused on the rhythm because the rhythm was something he could follow without thinking, and not thinking was, at this particular moment, the only way he could keep moving. The hole deepened. The night was still. 60 yards away through the tree line and across the yard and past the water trough, in a small cabin with 4 sleeping men inside it, a man named Elias was awake. He did not know about the shovels. He did not know about the tree line. He did not know that 3 men were, at this exact moment, preparing the ground to receive him. He was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling he could not see in the dark, thinking about seeds. That distance, 60 yards, 1 man thinking about seeds, 3 men with shovels, is the distance this story is going to cross. Slowly. Completely. Because the distance between those 2 points is not just 60 yards of Georgia clay. It is the distance between a life being lived and a story being told about that life. A story that had started weeks earlier in a drawing room over afternoon conversation, with a woman at a window saying something imprecise to someone who heard it differently than it was meant. A story that had traveled, through the specific machinery of that world, from imprecision to assumption to distortion to decision. A story that had arrived tonight at 3 men with shovels. His name was Elias. He hadn't done anything. If you are watching this for the first time, subscribe right now before we go further. This channel exists for stories that were buried. Some of them literally. It only survives if you stay with it. Now, let's go back to where this began. The problem is, he hadn't done anything. But by the time that truth would have mattered, the story had already traveled so far from it that the truth could not have caught up even if it had been running. He woke before the bell. Every morning without exception for 12 years, he woke before the bell. Not because someone had instructed him to. Not because the work required it. Because the 5 minutes before the bell were his. They belonged to him in a way that almost nothing else did, and Elias had learned, somewhere between the age of 8 and the age of 12, that 5 minutes belonging to you was a form of wealth that could not be inventoried, taxed, or taken. You had to protect it by being awake before anyone thought to count it. So he woke before the bell. He lay still first. This was the first thing, the lying still, the listening. The cabin held 4 other men in various states of sleep, and Elias had memorized the particular sound of each one's rest the way a musician memorizes an instrument. He could tell without looking, without moving, who was genuinely asleep and who was hovering in the shallow water between sleep and waking, who would need the bell and who was already beginning the slow surface toward the day. He lay still and he listened to the cabin breathe. Then he listened past the cabin. The night insects, in late September, thinning, the summer chorus winding down toward something quieter and more austere. The horses in the stable, whose nighttime sounds he had catalogued into a precise taxonomy. The shifting of weight that meant nothing, the particular stamp that meant discomfort, the low sustained sound that meant something in the perimeter was different. Tonight the horses sounded like weight shifting. Tonight the horses sounded like nothing. The distant main house, settling in the dark the way old wood settles. Not quite silence, never quite silence, the house making its nighttime inventory of its own structure. The third board near the cabin door, which creaked regardless of temperature or season or whether anyone stepped on it, as though it had decided long ago to make its presence known without requiring a cause. He counted these sounds the way other men count money, not from anxiety, but from the understanding that knowing what you have, precisely and completely, is the only foundation from which useful thinking can proceed. Then he rose. He dressed in the dark with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had dressed in darkness so many times that his hands had their own memory of the task. Each button, each tie, the specific resistance of fabric that had been washed so many times it had settled into the exact shape of his body. He moved without sound because moving without sound was not a special effort for him. It was simply how he moved. He pushed open the cabin door. The air hit him, cool, damp, the particular quality of very early morning in the last weeks of September, when summer has not quite finished but has stopped insisting. He stood in the doorway for a moment and breathed it in. What? Twice. A third time. This was also this standing, this breathing, this 30 seconds of being outside in the dark before the day made its claims. Then he moved toward the water trough. His path took him within 15 feet of the eastern wing of the main house. It had always taken him within 15 feet of the eastern wing. This was the direct path. He had walked it every morning for 2 years without incident, without thought, without any awareness that the path itself could become a fact in someone else's story. He reached the trough. He bent over it and cupped the water in both hands and brought it to his face, and the cold of it arrived all at once, sharp, clarifying, the way cold water announces the morning in a way that nothing else does. He did this 3 times. He straightened up. He looked at the sky, which was beginning to suggest light at the eastern edge without yet committing to it. He stood with the water still cold on his face and he looked at the sky for a moment. Then he turned and moved back toward the work of the day. He did not know that he had been watched. Inside, in the east wing, a woman named Caroline was standing at her window. She was 24 years old. She had come to stay at the Beaumont house in June, the younger sister of the master's wife, invited for a summer visit that had extended, without anyone quite deciding it should, well into September. She was standing at the window because she had not been sleeping well. She had developed, over the weeks of her difficult sleep, the habit of watching the light arrive, standing at the east-facing window in the pre-dawn and watching the sky perform its slow, unhurried transformation from black to blue to gray to something that could be called morning. She watched Elias wash his face. She watched the way he moved, and this is important because what she was observing was real, and what she made of it later was also real, and the gap between those two real things is where the catastrophe lives. What she was actually observing, a man who moved with precision and deliberateness, who washed his face with the attention of someone who was fully present in what he was doing, who stood afterward and looked at the sky in a way that suggested he was not simply occupying the morning but actually receiving it, noticing it, engaged with it, present to it in a way that the people Caroline usually watched move through early mornings were not. She thought, there is something about that man. This thought was not threatening. Was not fearful. It was, in its original form, the thought of a perceptive woman noticing a quality in another person, an interior life, a self-possession, a relationship to his own experience that she found arresting. She carried this thought for 3 days. She carried it in the way you carry something that interests you, turning it occasionally, looking at it from different angles. She was not afraid of Elias. She had not, in her original observation, generated fear. She had generated interest and something adjacent to admiration, and the mild frustration of seeing something clearly and not being able to fully articulate it. Then she made the mistake. She tried to articulate it. 3 days later. A Wednesday afternoon. The particular boredom of a Wednesday in late September that had nothing to distinguish it from the Wednesday before or the one to come. She was sitting with her sister-in-law Margaret in the drawing room, the two women in that comfortable afternoon intimacy of women who have been in close proximity long enough to exhaust the topics that require effort and have arrived at the territory of unguarded observation. She said, "There is something about that man, the quiet one in the field. Elias. Something I can't quite place. He watches. He is always watching. There's something in the way he carries himself." She said it imprecisely because the thing she had seen was imprecise. Or rather, it was precise in her experience of it and imprecise in the translation, the way anything complex becomes approximate when language tries to carry it from one mind to another. What she meant, There is an interior life to that man that is not legible to me, and I find that interesting. What Margaret heard: there is a man who is paying too much attention and I cannot identify his purpose. Margaret said, I've noticed it too. And in those 4 words, I've noticed it too, a story was born. Not through malice. Not through a lie. Through the ordinary, devastating human need to have our observations confirmed by another person, and through the way confirmation transforms a private impression into a shared fact, and through the way shared facts, in a world with a specific machinery, get fed into that machinery and come out the other side as something unrecognizable. Let us stay with Margaret for a moment, because Margaret is not a villain in this story, and it is important to understand what she was. Margaret Beaumont was 27 years old. She had grown up in this house. She had grown up watching her mother manage the house, watching her mother's specific vigilant attention to the people who worked in and around it, the continuous assessment, the alertness to any shift in the established order. She had absorbed this. Not through instruction. Through proximity. Through the gradual, invisible process of learning what the grown people in your world treat as important, until their importance becomes your instinct and you cannot remember a time when you did not feel it. She had grown up afraid. Not of anything specific. The fear was diffuse, ambient, structural, the kind of fear that lives in the bones of a world organized around a violence so foundational that even the people who benefit from it cannot look at it directly, and so it appears everywhere else. In the locks on doors, in the protocols of distance, in the management of who is permitted where and when and under whose supervision. This was the air Margaret had breathed for 27 years. When Caroline said there is something about that man, Margaret's mind moved along channels that had been laid down across those 27 years, and it arrived, smoothly and without resistance, at a specific kind of conclusion. She thought, Elias is a threat. She did not interrogate this thought. It arrived as recognition, not hypothesis, and in the world she lived in, recognition did not require verification. Now, what had Elias actually done in September? He had woken before the bell every morning. He had walked the path to the trough. He had worked the field at his calibrated pace, not the fastest, not the slowest, the exact pace he had spent years perfecting. The pace that said, I am here, I am functional, I am not interesting. He had thought, in the private theater of his own mind, about seeds and stars and the quality of light on clay and the specific way certain birds changed their flight patterns as the season shifted. He had repaired a section of fencing near his cabin because the gap was bothering the pigs and the pigs' problem would eventually become someone's assigned problem, and he preferred to address it before it reached that stage. He had sat, on 2 evenings, outside his cabin after supper and watched the sky go from blue to black with the quiet, sustained attention of a man who has found, in the study of small precise things, a way to keep his intelligence alive inside a world that had decided his intelligence was not a thing to be cultivated. That was September. That was the totality of what had happened. And it was already, without his knowledge, being converted into something else entirely. Margaret began watching Elias the following morning. She watched him the way you watch something you have already decided is suspicious, which is to say, she watched him in a mode that converted everything it received into confirmation. When he was quiet, she noted the quiet. When he looked up briefly from his work, she noted the look. When he moved through any part of the property, the movement registered as potentially purposeful rather than simply as a man moving through his day. She watched him this way for 2 weeks. She built a picture. The picture was assembled from real observations and false interpretations, stitched together with the anxious thread of a woman who had spent 27 years in a house that had taught her to be afraid, and who had now found a specific face for the fear. Not because the face was accurate. Because the face was available and available was enough. She began to talk about him. She did not do it dramatically. She did not issue declarations or make accusations. She worked in the register of small comments, the kind that plant something in the listener without announcing what they are planting. To the cook's assistant in passing, Elias seems distracted lately. To the laundress, while the work moved between them, have you noticed the way he moves near the east wing in the mornings? To her sister, the master's wife, over dinner, there's something in his manner I can't quite settle. Each comment alone was almost nothing. A small stone dropped into still water. But small stones make ripples. And ripples, given enough time and enough stones, begin to resemble a wave. Meanwhile, in the field, Elias was doing his calibrated work. He was not aware that his name was appearing in conversations he was not part of. He was aware, in the diffuse way of a man who has spent a lifetime reading the atmosphere around him, that something was slightly different. He couldn't name it. He couldn't locate it. It was the air pressure feeling, the thing that arrives before rain, registered by the body before the mind has organized the information into language. He noticed that Corwin had looked at him differently. Once on a Thursday. Once on the Monday after. Not with the targeted hostility of a man who has received a specific instruction. With something less defined, the speculative attention of a man who has been given a suggestion and is trying to decide what weight to assign it. A look that had no clear meaning yet. A look at the edge of developing. Elias noticed it. He adjusted. He moved himself. On the days he noticed the look, slightly closer to the center of the working group. More people around him, more witnesses, a less attractive target for isolated confrontation. He did this without appearing to do it. He did it the way he did everything that mattered. Invisibly, as a function of calibration so habitual it barely registered as conscious thought. He ranked his hypotheses and kept them. He did not know that the story existed. He did not know that his name had become a story. He only knew that the atmosphere was different, and that different atmospheres required different calibrations, and that he was, as he had always been, paying the finest possible attention to the world around him so that the world would not surprise him. The world was preparing to surprise him. The woman who changed the nature of the conversation was named Ruth. She was 32 years old. She was married to a man who owned a smaller property 2 miles east. She had what the social world of the county considered sharpness. She had opinions, she expressed them, she had the particular gift of the natural narrator. The ability to find the structure in a story, to identify which details land, to know instinctively what to emphasize and what to let go. She came to dinner in early October. She had been somewhat isolated for several weeks and arrived with the particular energy of a woman who has been saving her observations for an audience. She sat next to Margaret. Over the course of the meal, Margaret told her about Elias. She had been telling and retelling this story for 2 weeks by then, and she had learned through repetition what the story needed. She had learned that the detail about the east wing of the house was the detail that made faces change. She had learned that the description of his watchfulness, the contained, expressionless attention of a man who seemed always to be receiving more information than he was giving, was the detail that made people feel what she needed them to feel. She told it to Ruth with both details in the right places. Ruth listened with the full, focused attention of a natural storyteller receiving material. When Margaret finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I had a man like that once. On our place. Before we sold him." What Ruth meant by this in her own mind was something like, "I recognize this type of man. A man who watches. A man with an interior life that resists legibility." She was connecting her experience to Margaret's. But what she was doing, in the grammar of the conversation, was placing Elias in a category. She was saying, "This is a category I know. This is a category that has a known response. The response is removal." Margaret heard this. She did not say anything. But something settled in her. A confirmation. The particular relief of a fear that has been named and categorized by someone else. The relief of "I was right to be afraid." Ruth went home that evening with a story. She told it to her neighbor Frances, who lived on the property to the north and who had a husband who traveled for business and who therefore maintained a heightened, continuous alertness about the state of her household. Frances heard the story through the filter of that alertness. She did not hear, "A man who is quiet and watchful." She heard, "A man who is planning something." She told her husband when he returned. Her husband, George, a man of uncomplicated territorial instincts, went to speak to a man named Denton, who sat on the county court. Denton had already heard a version of the story from his wife, who had heard it from Ruth. When George arrived, their two versions confirmed each other. Each man felt the other had information he lacked, which made the story feel more substantial than either version alone. This is how rumor acquires the texture of evidence. Not through fabrication exactly, but through the multiplication of partial accounts until the sum feels like documentation. They talked for an hour. They agreed, this was a man to watch. Now let us watch the specific moment the story changed from description to accusation. It happened in a dry goods store. The woman who ran it was named Hester. She was a person for whom information was currency. She received it and distributed it and understood, intuitively, the social economy of knowing things that other people didn't know yet. She had heard the story from Ruth, in the casual way that stories pass between women who see each other regularly and who have developed the habit of sharing the texture of their days. Hester added something. She said she had heard, and note that word, heard, which already carries a qualification, a distance from certainty. She had heard that Elias had been seen speaking to a man from another property. At a road crossing. She wasn't sure of the details. Maybe the property to the south. Maybe it was nothing. She included it because it felt consistent. It felt consistent because the story had already created a framework, and the detail fit the framework, and when a detail fits a framework we rarely stop to ask whether the framework is accurate before we accept the detail. This detail entered the story. Within 2 more tellings, it had lost Hester's qualification entirely. The "I heard" had been stripped away. The "maybe" had been replaced by "definitely." People began to say, "He has been seen meeting with someone from the South property." People said it with the confidence of fact. It was not fact. It was Hester's uncertain addition, copied and hardened and transmitted until it could no longer be identified as uncertain. This is the mechanism of distortion, running at full speed. Real observations, false interpretations, uncertain additions, all flattened into a single, smooth, authoritative surface. The surface said, "Elias is dangerous." And now it had evidence. Pause here for a moment. Think about what has just happened in this story. A woman watched a man wash his face and found him interesting. That observation passed through 5 different people, each of whom had their own fears, their own frameworks, their own needs, and by the time it reached the 6th person, it was unrecognizable. It had become something that pointed, with apparent certainty, toward a man being a threat. He had washed his face. He had walked to work. He had watched the sky. And the story about him was now something that men with authority were taking seriously enough to discuss at dinner. If you've watched this happen, if you've seen someone's silence become evidence, someone's composure become suspicion, someone's ordinary life become a case against them, type "seen it" in the comments right now. Because this story is not as far from the present as the dates suggest. Here is the precise mechanism. It operates in loops. Each loop has 3 parts. Reality, interpretation, distortion. Loop 1. Reality: Elias passes within 15 feet of the east wing of the main house every morning, because that is the direct path to the water trough and he has walked it every morning for 2 years. Interpretation: he is paying particular attention to the east wing. Distortion: he is watching the east wing for a reason. The distortion follows from the interpretation with the smoothness of logic, as though it were reasoning. But it is not reasoning. It is the application of fear to observation, dressed in the clothes of reasoning. Loop 2. Reality: Elias speaks very little unless spoken to, because he has learned over 12 years that visibility has a cost and one of the costs of speaking is being visible. Interpretation: he is withholding something. Distortion: he is concealing something. Loop 3. Reality: Elias moves with precision and deliberateness, because a man who has calibrated his behavior for 12 years develops a precision in everything he does, the way any long practiced skill produces a quality of deliberateness. And the story about him was now something that men with authority were taking seriously enough to discuss at dinner. If you've watched this happen, if you've seen someone's silence become evidence, someone's composure become suspicion, someone's ordinary life become a case against them, type "seen it" in the comments right now. Because this story is not as far from the present as the dates suggest. Here is the precise mechanism. It operates in loops. Each loop has 3 parts. Reality, interpretation, distortion. Loop 1. Reality: Elias passes within 15 feet of the east wing of the main house every morning, because that is the direct path to the water trough and he has walked it every morning for 2 years. Interpretation: he is paying particular attention to the east wing. Distortion: he is watching the east wing for a reason. The distortion follows from the interpretation with the smoothness of logic, as though it were reasoning. But it is not reasoning. It is the application of fear to observation, dressed in the clothes of reasoning. Loop 2. Reality: Elias speaks very little unless spoken to, because he has learned over 12 years that visibility has a cost and one of the costs of speaking is being visible. Interpretation: he is withholding something. Distortion: he is concealing something. Loop 3. Reality: Elias moves with precision and deliberateness, because a man who has calibrated his behavior for 12 years develops a precision in everything he does, the way any long practiced skill produces a quality of deliberateness. Interpretation: he moves as though he is calculating something. Distortion: he is calculating something. Loop 4. Reality: Elias repaired a section of fencing near his cabin. Interpretation: he operated outside his assigned area. Distortion: he was using the fence repair as an excuse to move through a different part of the property. Each loop is self-sealing. Each one converts a real observation into a threatening meaning and then presents the threatening meaning as though it were the observation. And the loops compound, they reinforce each other, build on each other, until the structure they produce feels not like fear dressed as logic but like genuine understanding. A man who is watching the house and withholding something and calculating something, and using fence repairs to move through unauthorized areas is, in the grammar of these compounded distortions, a specific kind of man. A man with a plan. A man who is a problem. This is how the false story became real. Not through lying. Through the cumulative operation of fear converting everything it touches into confirmation of itself. There was a woman named Nora. She worked in the main house, not enslaved but employed, occupying the particular social position of a white woman of limited means in service to a household, neither fully inside the family's world nor outside it, absorbing information from both. She had heard Margaret's version of the story. She contributed something of her own. She told Della, the woman who cooked, who had worked in the house for 20 years, who moved through its spaces with the invisibility of someone whose labor was constant and whose presence the household had stopped consciously registering. She told Della that she had seen Elias lingering near the garden, near the section of the yard closest to the main house entrance, on multiple mornings. This was partially true. He passed through that area. He had always passed through that area. The distinction between passing through and lingering is a matter of pace and intent, and Nora had applied the story's framework to her own memory and produced a recollection that fit what the story needed. She told Della. Della listened without speaking. Nora interpreted this silence as agreement. It was not agreement. Della's silence was the silence of a woman who had spent 20 years developing the specific skill of receiving information from dangerous people without revealing what she was doing with it. She was doing something very precise with what Nora had just told her. She was calculating. She was calculating the distance between where the story was and where it was going, and whether there was anything she could do in that distance, and what the cost of doing it would be, and whether the cost was one she could survive. She carried this calculation for 3 days. Meanwhile, Elias. Let us go back to him because he is the center of this story and the story has been moving outward in all directions away from him, and it is time to return to the man himself, to the specific, daily, interior reality of the person the story was being built around. He woke before the bell. He dressed in the dark. He washed his face. He worked the field. He thought about seeds and stars and the quality of the light. But the atmosphere had continued to shift, and he was a man who read atmospheres for survival, and he was beginning to feel the shift as something more than diffuse. Something with a direction. Corwin's looks had increased. Not dramatically, not with the sudden visible targeting that would have named itself as danger. Gradually. The way a temperature drops, each individual degree imperceptible, the cumulative change undeniable. He was also noticing the other workers. Not all of them. But some of them had developed a particular quality of not looking at him, the deliberate non-eye contact of people who have been told or who have sensed that looking at a certain person is not neutral. That attention to that person has a cost they would prefer not to pay. He noticed this. He filed it. He sat with his hypotheses in the evenings and ranked them and re-ranked them, and the hypothesis that was climbing the ranking was the one he was least equipped to address. Someone with authority has been given a reason to focus on me, and I do not know what the reason is, and not knowing the reason means I cannot address it. He had spent 12 years being able to address every threat he encountered. He had been able to address them because he could see them, because his calibration was precise enough that he could identify a problem before it became acute and adjust his behavior to redirect it. This was different. This was a problem that was forming outside his field of vision, in rooms he was not in conversations he was not part of, and the problem was coming toward him and he could feel it coming but he could not see it clearly enough to step out of its path. He sat outside his cabin on an evening in early October and looked at the sky and felt, for the first time in years, the specific, cold weight of helplessness. Not the ordinary helplessness of his condition, which he had metabolized long ago, but something more targeted, more immediate. Something was coming. He did not know what. He breathed. He watched the sky go from blue to black. He went inside. George told Harold Beaumont at the county court. He pulled him aside after the formal session, in the corridor, in the particular register of men who are communicating things that have not yet been formalized, the register of implication and suggestion that allows information to be transferred without the commitment of official declaration. He said, "I've been hearing some things about one of yours. The one they call Elias." Harold was 29. He had inherited this property from a father he had not liked, along with a system he had not created and had not, in any serious way, examined. He received George's information with the practiced composure of a young man who has learned that projecting authority means not visibly reacting. He asked a few questions. George's answers were vague because George's information was vague. He had heard things from his wife. His wife had heard them from Ruth. Ruth had heard them from Margaret. Margaret had started with Caroline, who had started with a private observation from a window. But the story that reached Harold had the smooth, hardened surface of received fact. All the qualifications had been stripped in transit. What remained was a story about a man who was watching the house, meeting contacts from other properties, operating outside his assignments, concealing his intentions. Harold said, "I'll look into it." He spoke to Corwin. Corwin received this information the way a man receives useful news when he has been looking for an opportunity to demonstrate his value. He said, "I've noticed it too." He had not, until this conversation, consciously noticed anything about Elias beyond his functional competence and his quietness. But when Harold told him the story, Corwin's memory reorganized itself with the seamless fluency that all memories use when they are asked to serve a conclusion, and he found, in the reorganized record, exactly what the story needed. The fence repair. Operating outside his assignment. The morning at the trough. Positioning near the house. The evenings outside the cabin. Watching. What was he watching? Corwin said, "I'll watch him more closely." He did. There is a specific quality of being watched that a careful man can feel. It is not always possible to identify the exact mechanism. The slightly longer duration of a glance, the particular angle of peripheral attention, the way certain people in your environment begin to orient toward you with a fraction more focus than the situation requires. It is a felt thing, arriving below the level of explicit perception. Elias felt it. He had felt Corwin's attention sharpening for the past 2 weeks, and now it had become something he could not explain away with his secondary hypotheses. It was targeted. It was him specifically. And it was accompanied now by the attention of one of the other workers, a younger man who had started watching him in the way that suggested he had been asked to. He adjusted more significantly. He stopped sitting outside the cabin in the evenings. Not because someone had told him to. Because the evenings outside had become a time when he was visible and unoccupied, and visible and unoccupied was a combination he could no longer afford. He ate inside. He kept his movements to the necessary paths. He further reduced the already minimal amount he spoke. He was becoming, in response to a danger he could not see, even more invisible than he had managed to be. And even this, the increased withdrawal, the more careful silence, the more contained movement, was being read by Corwin as confirmation. A man who tightens his behavior when he is watched is a man who knows he is watched. A man who knows he is watched is a man who has something to hide. Every response Elias made to the pressure was converted, by the machine of distortion, into evidence for the story the machine was telling. He could not win. Not because he was guilty. Because the machine was not evaluating him. The machine had already decided, and was now simply finding its justification. It was in the second week of October that Corwin found what he needed. He was at the edge of the property, near the south fence, attending to something that required his presence there in the late afternoon. The road that ran along the southern border was one that workers from adjacent properties occasionally used for legitimate movement, errands, messages, the ordinary logistics of labor in a rural county. A man from the property to the south came along the road. He and Elias met at the crossing. They talked for 4 minutes. The weather. The quality of the road in the stretch near the creek. The kind of conversation that two people have when they encounter each other in a shared space, and the social grammar of the moment requires acknowledgement and brief exchange. Corwin watched from 40 yards. He could not hear what was said. What he saw, 2 men standing near a road talking. What he understood, a meeting. A contact. The thing the story had described. He went to Harold that evening. He said, "I saw it. The meeting. Tonight. I saw it myself." Harold asked, "What did they say?" Corwin said, "I was too far to hear. But the meeting happened." Harold sat with this for a moment. Then he said, "Let me think about it." He thought about it for 4 days. During those 4 days, the story was in every room Harold moved through. His wife's anxiety at dinner. Margaret's careful, sustained concern. The knowledge that men he respected, Denton George Holt, had already formed their view. On the 4th day Harold made his decision. He went to Corwin. He said, "Handle it quietly. I don't want trouble. Handle it quietly." 3 words. In the world this story is set in, those 3 words were not ambiguous. They did not mean, investigate. They did not mean, speak to the man. They did not mean, produce evidence and submit it to a process. They meant, remove the problem in a way that cannot be easily examined. And the most complete, most permanent form of removal was the form that produced no subsequent questions, no complications, no testimony. Corwin went to Whitmore. Whitmore went to Els. And on the evening of October 27, 1847, 3 men walked to the eastern tree line with shovels. Elias woke before the bell. As he always had. As he had done for 12 years. But this morning, the morning after the partial grave was dug, though he did not know the grave existed, though the word grave had not yet entered his understanding of his own situation. This morning his body woke him earlier than usual, and the quality of wakefulness was different. Not the clean, alert wakefulness of a man who has rested and is ready. The shallow, exhausted wakefulness of a man whose sleep has been defending him against something he has not yet named. He lay on his back in the dark. He listened to the cabin breathe. The other men, their sleep was the usual patterns, the usual depths. Nothing had changed in the cabin's atmosphere. The cabin was what it always was. But he was awake in a way that was not the usual before the bell wakefulness, and his body was telling him something, and the thing his body was telling him was arriving below the threshold of language. He lay still. He breathed. He moved through his hypotheses. The story that was being told about him, he still did not know its content, its shape, its origin, how far it had traveled or who had told it or where it had arrived. He knew only that the atmosphere had been wrong for several weeks and that it was getting more wrong, and that the direction it was moving in was a direction he recognized in the abstract even if he could not see it specifically. The direction was, someone with authority has decided something about you. And the decision has been made. And what happens next is a function of that decision, not of anything you do or do not do. He understood this. He had understood it in a general way for his entire life, the way any man in his position understands it, which is to say, in the bones, below articulation, as a foundational fact of the world he inhabits. But understanding it in the general was different from feeling it becoming specific, feeling it arriving, feeling it narrow from the abstract category of this is always possible to the concrete category of this is now approaching. He lay in the dark and felt it narrowing. Then he rose. He dressed. He went outside. He washed his face. He looked for a moment at the eastern tree line. He had no reason to look at the eastern tree line specifically. His eyes moved there as part of the comprehensive scan he always made, the full sweep horizon to horizon, that was as automatic as breathing. He looked at the tree line. He looked at the sky. He looked at the main house. He looked at the stable. Everything looked the way it always looked. He did not see the disturbed earth at the base of the trees. He turned and moved toward the day. 60 yards behind him, behind the tree line, the partially dug grave waited. It was approximately 3 feet deep. The shovels had been left nearby, concealed under brush. The plan was to finish the following night. The plan was clean and simple and had been executed in its first phase without complication. Corwin slept without difficulty. Whitmore slept without difficulty. Els lay awake for an hour, staring at the ceiling of his room, and then slept. The grave waited. Della was awake. She had been awake since before Elias. She had been awake since 2 in the morning, lying in the small room off the kitchen that was her space, with her eyes open and her mind running the calculation she had been running for 3 days. She knew the shape of what was coming. She had not been told directly, no one had sat Della down and explained the plan to her. But she had spent 20 years moving through this house, performing its invisible labor, and in 20 years she had developed a precise and comprehensive understanding of how information moved through it. She knew which conversations happened in which rooms, at which hours, in which voices. She knew what the dropping of Harold's voice to a specific register meant. She knew what the particular set of Corwin's shoulders meant when he left the house after speaking with the master. She had assembled the picture. The picture was they were going to kill Elias. In a way that would not be formally acknowledged. She lay in the dark and held this picture and felt its weight. Then she ran the calculation. The calculation was, what can I do, what will it cost, can I survive the cost, and is the cost worth the outcome? She had run versions of this calculation before. For other people, in other situations. Sometimes she had acted. Sometimes she had not. And the time she had not acted, she carried. Not as guilt exactly, guilt was a luxury that required a kind of safety she did not have, but as a weight. As the specific heaviness of survival that has been purchased at the cost of someone else. She had run the calculation for 3 days because the answer kept changing depending on which variables she weighted. If she went to Harold, she revealed that she overheard conversations she was not supposed to be hearing, which was the source of whatever protection her position provided. She also handed the situation to the person who had created it, and his resolution would not be justice, it would be management. A different kind of disposal. If she went to Corwin, she might as well not act at all. If she went to the other workers, she put them in the position of knowing what she knew, which was its own kind of danger. But there was one other option. Caroline. Caroline, who had started this. Who had been visibly uncomfortable for weeks, in the particular way of someone whose words have traveled further than they intended and who has been watching the distance widen and not knowing how to close it. who had something the others didn't have. A direct line to Harold that was not mediated by the same framework of authority and hierarchy that made the other channels dangerous. And who might, Della thought she might, be willing to use it. If Della gave her the information precisely enough. If Della made it impossible to not act. Della found Caroline the following morning. Early. Before the household had fully woken. In the narrow window of time between the servants' work beginning and the family's day beginning, in the half-light of a kitchen that smelled of the fire being built and the particular beginning of morning smell of a house restarting itself. She spoke quietly and quickly. She did not explain how she knew. She did not build to it. She said, "There are men planning to kill Elias tonight. They have started digging behind the eastern tree line. I believe you can stop this, and I believe you did not mean for it to go where it went." She said nothing else. She left. Caroline stood in the kitchen doorway after Della disappeared. The fire was building. The kitchen was warming. Outside the window the light was arriving in the gray, unhurried way of an October morning. She stood and she felt the specific, suffocating weight of the sentence. "I believe you did not mean for it to go where it went." She replayed it. The afternoon in the drawing room. The imprecision of what she had said. There is something about him. The way Margaret had responded. The 4 words, "I've noticed it too." And then the weeks of watching the story move further and further from the thing she had actually meant, watching it grow into something she did not recognize, trying twice to qualify it and failing, telling herself it was not her place, telling herself that Margaret and the others knew more than she did, telling herself. She stopped telling herself things. She thought about the eastern tree line. She thought about Elias washing his face in the pre-dawn dark. The quality of attention she had watched in him that first morning. The interior life she had recognized, clearly, accurately, and tried to translate into words and failed, and handed the failed translation to a world that had its own machinery for such things. She had not meant for this. That was true. But not meaning for something and not having caused it were different things, and standing in the kitchen doorway of a house on the morning of the day when someone was going to die because of something she had said, however imprecisely, however innocently, she felt the difference between those two things with a clarity that was not comfortable and not negotiable. She went upstairs. She washed her face. She dressed. She spent 2 hours in the drawing room working out what she was going to say. Then she knocked on the door of Harold's office. She stood in the room and told him what she knew. She did not tell him about Della. She protected that. She said she had overheard something, which was technically true, and was all he needed to understand the substance. She said, "There is a plan. Corwin and 2 other men. The eastern tree line. Tonight." Harold's face was composed. But his hands on the desk were still in a way that was slightly too careful. He said, "Where did you hear this?" She said, "Does it matter where? Is it true?" He was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than a moment. Then he said, "I'll speak to Corwin." She said, "Today? This morning?" He met her eyes. He said, "Yes. This morning." He spoke to Corwin before noon. The conversation was brief. It was conducted in the register of men communicating about things they would prefer not to name directly. Harold said, "Stop what you've started. The tree line. Stop it." Corwin said, "You said handle it." Harold said, "I said handle it quietly. Not that. Not in that way. Stop it." There was a pause in which both men were aware of the gap between what Harold had said and what Harold had meant and what Corwin had heard and what Corwin had done, and neither man named the gap because naming it would require one or both of them to examine something they did not want to examine. Corwin said, "What do you want done with him?" Harold said, "Sell him. Arrange a sale. Next week." This was Harold's resolution. It was not justice. It was management. A different form of disposal, the auction block instead of the tree line, a transaction instead of a grave. Elias's life would not end this week. But Elias's life as it was in this county among these people would end. He would be moved. The problem would be relocated. The machinery would have processed him and produced an outcome that everyone involved could file under handled. Everyone involved would continue their lives. Elias would continue his elsewhere, carrying whatever story had attached itself to his name in Beaumont County, not knowing its content, not knowing its origin. If the story had ended there, it would have been a story about a system that processed a man and moved on. But the story did not end there. Della had not waited for Caroline's conversation with Harold. She had initiated it, yes. She had trusted Caroline to do what Della calculated she would do. But Della was not a woman who operated on trust alone. She operated on parallel tracks. She covered the angle she could not control with a move on the angle she could. The same morning she spoke to Caroline, she sent a message. Not through writing. She did not write in the formal sense, because writing had been made inaccessible to her the way it had been made inaccessible to most people in her position. But she sent a message in the way messages traveled in that world when they needed to travel without leaving traces in the record. Through a person, in specific words, carried in memory rather than on paper. The person was a young woman who helped in the kitchen and who had a brother who worked on the South property. The words were simple and specific, and in the particular compressed language of people who have developed systems of communication under conditions that require compression. The message reached James by midday. James received it and was still for a moment. He knew what it meant. Not every detail, he didn't need every detail. He understood the shape. He understood this week, be ready. He understood the road, the second crossing after the bell. He understood what was being asked of him and what it would require and what it would cost if it went wrong. He thought about the 4-minute conversation at the road crossing. Weather and the quality of the road. The careful normalcy of a man who maintained his normalcy as a survival strategy. He had recognized it. He had recognized it the way you recognize something that resembles your own reflection. He thought for a while. Then he went to make arrangements. The arrangements took 3 days. This is the 3-day gap in the record. The space between Harold's instruction to sell and the ledger entry that reads not found. 3 days during which Elias continued his ordinary life, continued waking before the bell and washing his face and working his calibrated field work, continued feeling the atmosphere press around him from directions he could not see, continued holding his hypotheses and re-ranking them. On the second day something happened. He was working in the field when James passed on the road. They did not look at each other directly. They did not stop. But James, in passing, dropped something, a small thing barely visible, into the grass at the edge of the road, and continued walking. Elias saw it. He finished the row he was working. He moved at the end of the row to the edge of the field to drink water, which was a routine movement that no one watching would have found unusual. He reached down to pull a weed that was not a problem and his hand, close to the ground, found the thing James had left. A piece of bark. Not remarkable. Except that it was scored with 3 marks on one side. 3 marks. Elias pressed his thumb against them once and then let the bark fall back into the grass and stood and drank his water and returned to his row. 3 marks. He turned this over in his mind for the rest of the day. He was careful not to let it show on his face, not the knowledge, not the question, not the shift in his interior state that the knowledge had produced. He let his expression do the thing it always did, which was nothing. He let his hands do the field work. He let his body maintain the calibration. But inside something had changed. Someone knows. Someone is moving. 3 marks. That night he lay on his pallet and felt, for the first time in weeks, something other than the cold narrowing of threat. He felt something that was not quite hope. Hope was too large, too fragile, too easily destroyed to be the word for it. He felt something smaller and more durable than hope. He felt possibility. The specific, quiet, careful possibility of a man who has been moving through a closing space and has just glimpsed, in the closing, a narrow opening. He did not sleep more. But the quality of his wakefulness changed. He was waiting now rather than simply enduring. On the 3rd day, after the bell had rung and the evening had settled and the main house had gone through its sequence of lamps going dark, Elias dressed in the dark for the last time in this cabin. He dressed with the same unhurried care with which he always dressed. He moved without sound because he had always moved without sound. He did not take anything, there was very little to take, and taking things would have announced intention, and announcing intention was not in his nature and was not in his plan. He went to the door. He stepped outside. The night was cool and dark and still. The insects were thin now, October almost finished, the chorus reduced to a few persistent voices. The horses made no unusual sounds. The main house was dark. He looked at the eastern tree line for a moment. He had looked at it every morning for 2 years from the water trough. He had looked at it the morning after the grave was partially dug without knowing what was there. He had looked at it this morning and the morning before. He looked at it now and turned away from it and walked, not running, not hurrying, at the measured, deliberate pace of a man who has learned that urgency produces visibility, toward the south fence, toward the road, toward the crossing where James had left the bark. He reached the crossing. James was there. 2 other people were there. Their names are not in the record and will not be invented here because they do not need names to have been real, and because the people who ran these operations understood that names in the record were danger. They did what needed to be done in the darkness and the anonymity of a world that would not have allowed them to do it in the light. They moved quietly, at the pace of people who have learned that this hour, this dark, this narrow window between the last lamp going out and the first bell of morning, is the only hour that belongs entirely to movement. They moved north, then east, then north again. They moved through the dark county, through the fields and the tree lines and the creeks and the particular geography of a place that had been organized for one purpose, and that was, in this moment, being navigated for its opposite. Elias moved with them. He did not speak. He breathed the cold October air, and he felt the ground under his feet change, the red clay of the field, then the harder packed earth of the road, then the softer give of the grass at the roadside, then the creek crossing where the water was cold and shallow, and the sound of it filled the night and made a brief window of noise inside which their own movement was covered. He moved. He did not look back. Not because there was nothing behind him. Because looking back in a moment like this is a kind of invitation for the thing behind you to catch up, and Elias had spent 31 years not issuing that invitation. He moved forward. Through the dark. Into whatever was on the other side. The record says, not found. Search concluded. No recovery. The record was correct about the facts and wrong about what they meant. Not found was not a failure. Not found was the whole point. The historical record of black survival in the 18th and 19th century American South is a record of what the powerful chose to write down. It is a record of transactions and inventories and legal documents and court proceedings. A record, in other words, of the machinery. What the machinery did not write down was the counter-machinery. The networks. The people like James, who knew people who had been moving information, and then people through the dark counties for years, who operated without documentation because documentation was how the machinery found you. Who understood that the most important work they did would leave no trace in the official record, and who did it anyway, and who passed the knowledge of how to do it to the next person, and the next, until the network was larger than any single participant and more durable than any single act. This is what Della knew when she sent the message. This is what James knew when he made the arrangements. This is what the 3 marks on the bark meant. We know. We are moving. Come to the crossing. Elias could not have known, that night, moving through the dark, he could not have known the full shape of the system he had been received into. He could not have known how far back it went, how many people had moved through it before him, how many more would move through it after. He could not have known the specific, extraordinary labor that had gone into building a channel of survival through the geography of captivity, the relationships maintained across property lines, the information passed in coded language, the people positioned in exactly the right places to know exactly the right things. He could not have known. But he was inside it. He was being carried by it. He was moving north in the dark, held by something larger than himself, built by people whose names are not in the record and whose work was the most essential work of the world they lived in. The morning the sale was to be arranged, Harold sent Corwin to bring Elias in from the field. Corwin went. He returned without Elias. He said, "He's not in the field." Harold checked the cabin. He checked the surrounding areas. He sent men to the road. He sent men to the south fence line. He sent men to the tree line, and there, at the base of the eastern trees, he saw the disturbed earth of the partial grave, which Corwin had not thought to fill in, which stood there in the cold October morning light as the most accurate statement anyone had made about this situation. Harold looked at it. He stood and he looked at it for a long time. He did not ask Corwin to explain it. He did not call the situation to anyone's formal attention. He ordered the search. 3 days. Limited. The kind of search that fulfills the obligation of searching without seriously expecting to find. On the 3rd day he wrote in the ledger, or had someone write, "Elias, not found, search concluded, no recovery." He closed the ledger. He did not speak about it again. Neither did Corwin. Neither did Whitmore. Els left the county 6 months later. He moved 3 states north and worked for the rest of his life as a carpenter. He was known among his neighbors as a quiet man who did not talk about his past. Margaret and Caroline both knew, in different ways and to different degrees, what had happened and what had been prevented. They did not speak about it with each other. The subject settled between them like silt at the bottom of a river, present, specific, impossible to ignore if you looked directly at the bottom, easy to avoid if you kept your eyes on the surface. Caroline left Beaumont County in the spring of 1848. She went north. She did not come back. Della remained. She remained for 17 more years, moving through the house, performing its labor, listening to its conversations, occasionally using what she heard the way she had used what she heard about Elias. Quietly, precisely, in service of someone who needed it more than she needed the safety of not acting. She was 53 years old when emancipation came. She stated her name for the Freedmen's Bureau worker. She stated her age. She said she had no family to locate. The worker noted her composure. He found it unusual. He did not know what was behind it. 20 years of surviving in a house by making herself invisible, 3 days of calculation. One sentence delivered in a kitchen at dawn to a woman who needed to hear it. The knowledge that a man named Elias was alive somewhere in the north because of what she had done. The knowledge that his being alive was a fact that would never appear in any record, but that was nonetheless the most real thing she had ever done. She was 53 years old. She walked out of the Freedmen's Bureau office into the spring air. She kept walking. What did Elias carry? He carried the 12 years of calibration. The 5 minutes before the bell that had always belonged to him. The precision of a man who had metabolized constraints so completely that it became a kind of intelligence. An extraordinary, specific, patient intelligence that had kept him alive not through confrontation but through attention. He carried the knowledge of seeds and stars and the quality of light on red clay. The creak of the third board. The horses at night. The way certain birds changed their flight patterns as the seasons shifted. He carried the 3 marks on the bark. The crossing in the dark. The cold of the October creek on his feet and the sound of the water filling the night and the feeling of being held by something larger than himself, built by people he would never fully know. He carried the knowledge, partial, incomplete, but present, that something had been prepared for him that he had escaped. He would never know the full shape of it. He would never know about Caroline at the window or Ruth at the dinner table or Hester at the dry goods store. He would never know how the story had been built. He would never know the name of the woman who had stood in the kitchen in the pre-dawn dark and said, "I believe you did not mean for it to go where it went," to someone who needed to hear it. He carried the weight of that not knowing. And he carried the knowledge that he was alive. That the machinery had prepared the end of him and the machinery had not won. Not because of justice. Not because someone had examined the story and found it false and corrected it. Not because the world he lived in had produced a mechanism for the protection of his life. Because Della had calculated 3 days. Because James had left Bark at a road crossing. Because Caroline had knocked on a door. Because a network of people, whose names are not in the official record, had been built across the dark counties for exactly this. For exactly the moment when the machinery was running and someone needed a different path through the dark. He was alive. Let us speak plainly about what was almost lost. Not just a life. A specific life. The specific interior life of a man who had spent 31 years paying the finest possible attention to the world around him. Who had found, inside the extreme constraint of his existence, a relationship to beauty, to intelligence, to the small precise study of things, that was entirely his own. Who had watched the sky go from blue to black on October evenings and found it worth watching. Who thought about seeds and what they know without thinking. Who had, in the most honest possible sense, lived, not survived, not merely endured, but lived inside a life that the world around him did not acknowledge as a life worth protecting. The story was told about him that he was a danger. He was not a danger. He was a man with an interior life that the story could not reach. And the story built from a window observation and an afternoon conversation and 5 different women's fears and 3 men's authority and 1 overseer's shovel. The story had come within 1 day, 1 conversation, 1 calculated act of intervention, of ending that interior life without ever knowing it existed. Share this story right now, with anyone you know who has been made into a story. Who has been read through someone else's fear. Whose silence has been called suspicious, whose composure has been called calculating, whose existence has been made into evidence for something they did not do. Because the machinery this story describes did not end in 1847. It adapted. It changed its forms. It found new surfaces. And the people who moved through the dark, who built the networks, who calculated the risk, who said the necessary thing in the necessary year at the necessary hour, they adapted too. They kept moving. They kept building. This is their story as much as it is Elias's. There is a version of this story that the official record preserved. It is 3 lines in a damaged ledger. Elias, not found, search concluded, no recovery. The handwriting is clear. The ink has aged to brown. The page around it has the water damage of decades. The ledger was found in a county record storage facility in the 1970s by a researcher who was looking for something else and noted it in passing. 3 lines. That is what the record chose to hold. But records are a choice. Every entry in a ledger is a decision about what is worth writing down and what is not. The people who maintained that ledger were recording what the machinery considered important. Transactions, outcomes, problems processed and resolved. Not found was a problem processed. The record noted it and moved on. What the record did not write. A woman stood at a window at dawn and saw a man in full possession of himself and was moved by it and did not have words for the moving. A woman spent 20 years learning the conversations of a house in order to be useful at the specific moment usefulness was possible. A man made 3 marks on a piece of bark and left it at a road crossing. A woman knocked on a door and said the thing that needed to be said. A man walked north through a cold October night, held by a network that had been built in the dark by people who knew that the dark was where survival happened. None of this is in the ledger. All of it is more real than the ledger. This is what unmarked history is. Not the record of what the machinery preserved. The record of what the machinery tried to erase and failed to erase because the people it tried to erase were not passive. They were not objects of history. They were the most intelligent, the most strategic, the most psychologically complex actors in their own stories, and in each other's stories, and in the story of a world that was, despite everything, not entirely successful in its attempt to reduce them to 3 lines in a damaged ledger. Not found. He was found. He found himself. He found the crossing in the dark. He moved north. He carried everything. He continued. The question this story leaves, the question it is designed to leave, not as a rhetorical device but as a genuine inquiry that should follow you out of this video, is this. What is the cost of an imprecise observation shared in the wrong room with the wrong person, in a world with machinery that knows how to use it? And its companion question. What is the value of a woman who calculates 3 days and then acts anyway? These questions are not historical. They are immediate. They are the questions of every room where a story is being told about someone who is not in the room. They are the questions of every moment when a perception is being translated into language and the language is imprecise and the receiver has their own machinery and the machinery is already running. They are the questions of the distance between I notice something and I know what it means. That distance is where Elias almost died. That distance is where most of the machinery operates. That distance is where attention, genuine, accurate, humble, resistant to its own conclusions attention, is the only thing that slows the machinery down. Elias paid attention. Della paid attention. Caroline finally paid attention to what her words had become. The question is whether we do. If this story stayed with you, if any part of it landed differently than you expected, tell me in the comments which moment hit the hardest. Tell me if you recognize the machinery. Tell me if you've seen it run. Subscribe to Unmarked History, because this is what we do here. We find the 3 lines in the ledger and we ask what was behind them. We find the people the record filed under absence and we restore them to the fullness of what they actually were. Wherever you are watching from, say so below. Every comment is a way of saying, this story matters. And it does. It always did. This has been Unmarked History.